Imagine a crop that can survive extreme drought.
Right.
Like it thrives in blistering heat, requires almost zero irrigation, and, naturally cures some of the most pressing modern nutritional deficits we face today.
That's almost hard to believe.
Yeah. Now imagine that this miracle plant has been cultivated for over 3,000 years. It's perfectly adapted to its environment.
Exactly.
And then imagine that society just collectively decides to throw it in the garbage, like completely abandoning it for crops that drain our water tables and offer, a fraction of the nutrition.
It honestly sounds like a dystopian science fiction plot. Like humanity actively choosing fragility over resilience. But it's not fiction. It's the very real recent history of agriculture in several parts of the world.
Right. Well, welcome to the deep dive. We know you love gaining knowledge quickly but thoroughly. You're always hungry for that aha moment, that sudden shift in perspective.
But without drowning in the endless, unstructured information overload that clutters up our feeds.
Exactly. So today, we have a very specific mission. We're exploring an incredible transformation currently unfolding in rural India. And our source material today is a remarkably detailed case study, along with a collection of surrounding reports from Vikalp Sangam.
Yeah, and just for some context on the source for you listening, Vikalp Sangam is this platform dedicated entirely to documenting alternative development models.
Which is so refreshing.
It really is.
Yeah.
They don't just point out societal failures. They actively seek out grassroots solutions that are ecologically sustainable, socially equitable, and crucially, actually working in practice.
Right. They're highlighting the wins. And the focal point of today's deep dive is something that, honestly, it seems entirely mundane at first glance. It's just a piece of small-scale machinery.
A very specific machine.
Right. But we're going to look at how this one brilliantly engineered machine is rescuing those 3,000-year-old supergrains from extinction.
And completely upending local gender dynamics in the process.
Yeah, and fighting back against a global health crisis, it's huge. But to understand the machine, we first have to understand the patient it's trying to save. The grains themselves. We're talking about the small millets.
Specifically, the reports focus on finger millet, kodo, little foxtail, proso, barnyard, and brown top millets.
That's quite the list.
It is, yeah. And to grasp why these grains matter, you really have to understand who grows them. Historically, these small millets have been the absolute bedrock of sustenance for marginalized communities across the vast rain-fed regions of India.
Okay.
The case studies specifically highlight the reliance of scheduled tribes and scheduled castes on these crops.
Let's clarify that for a global audience real quick. When we
Right.
talk about scheduled tribes and scheduled castes in India, we are referring to communities that have faced profound historical, social, and economic marginalization.
Yes. Over centuries, many of these indigenous and marginalized communities were essentially pushed into or geographically isolated within the most challenging agricultural environments.
Right, the tough land.
Exactly. We're talking about arid lands, uneven terrain, areas entirely dependent on unpredictable monsoon rains rather than, stable irrigation systems like rivers or canals.
Right.
So for these communities, farming wasn't about exporting cash crops. It was about sheer, unyielding survival. And for millennia, small millets were the ultimate survival mechanism.
Because they're basically biological tanks. The nutritional profile alone is staggering.
It really is.
They are incredibly rich in protein, packed with essential micronutrients, loaded with dietary fiber, naturally gluten-free. Oh, and they have a very low glycemic index.
And that low glycemic index is crucial.
Yeah.
It dictates how fast your body converts carbohydrates into glucose. So white rice spikes your blood sugar immediately.
Yeah.
But small millets release energy slowly. They maintain steady blood sugar levels.
Which is huge for diabetes.
Exactly. And this ties directly into what public health professionals in the reports call the triple burden of malnutrition.
Okay, let's unpack this triple burden. Because usually when we hear the word malnutrition, the immediate image that comes to mind is simply a lack of calories, like starvation.
Right. That's the traditional understanding. And it does form the first part of the burden stagnating undernutrition. That's when people simply do not get enough caloric energy or basic sustenance to maintain healthy bodily functions.
Okay, so that's burden number one.
Yeah. But the modern food system introduced two more burdens that now exist simultaneously, often in the exact same communities and sometimes even in the exact same households.
That's wild. So the second burden being micronutrient deficiency, right?
Yes. You can consume 3,000 calories a day of, say, heavily processed, polished white rice and still be starving on a cellular level.
Because you're lacking iron, zinc, calcium, all the vitamins.
Exactly. You have the bulk, but not the building blocks. And then the third burden is the rising incidence of overweight and obesity,
Wow.
which brings along a tidal wave of non-communicable diseases, most notably type 2 diabetes.
So you literally have people who are underfed, people who are vitamin starved, and people who are obese and diabetic all at the exact same time.
Precisely. And the magic of small millets is that they're chemically structured to fight all three.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, they provide dense caloric energy for the undernourished, they're packed with the trace minerals for the micronutrient deficient, and their high fiber and low glycemic index combat obesity and manage diabetes.
It really is the perfect food for the modern health crisis.
Well, it is.
But their biological genius goes even deeper than human digestion, right? Because the Vikalp-Sangam material notes that these millets are C4 crops.
Yes, and that is where their ecological superpowers come into play. To understand why a C4 crop is so special, we have to talk briefly about plant biology.
Okay, lay it on me.
Most of the plants we rely on, like wheat and paddy rice, are C3 crops. During photosynthesis, they use an enzyme called rubisco to capture carbon dioxide from the air.
Okay, Rubisco. Got it.
The problem is, rubisco is famously inefficient. If the weather gets hot, rubisco accidentally grabs oxygen instead of carbon dioxide, which just wastes the plant's energy.
Oh, interesting. So how does a C3 plant compensate for that inefficiency when it's hot out?
It has to keep the pores on its leaves, the stomata wide open for longer periods, to constantly flush its system with fresh carbon dioxide.
But wait, if you leave the pores open in a hot climate, doesn't the plant lose water?
Massive amounts of water, yes, through evaporation.
Ah, so C3 crops like paddy rice are incredibly thirsty because they're basically sweating all their water out just to breathe in the heat.
That is exactly what's happening. But small millets are C4 crops. They've evolved a completely different, highly specialized leaf anatomy. They essentially have a biological carbon dioxide pump.
A pump.
Yeah. They rapidly capture CO2 and pump it deep into specialized cells where rubisco is isolated away from the oxygen.
Well, it's smart.
Because this internal pump is so hyper-efficient, a C4 plant can keep its stomata partially closed during the hottest parts of the day.
Meaning it stops the water from evaporating?
Yes, they conserve massive amounts of water while still photosynthesizing at maximum capacity.
That is amazing.
This is why small millets are highly climate resilient. They tolerate extreme heat, they survive prolonged drought, and they require a fraction of the water compared to paddy rice.
Incredible.
Furthermore, they have deep, fibrous root systems that extract nutrients from poor soils, meaning they require almost zero synthetic chemical fertilizers or pesticides.
Okay, so when you lay it all out like that, it makes the historical data from this case study absolutely mind-boggling.
It's tragic, honestly.
Right. You have the perfect human health food and the perfect climate-resilient crop. Yet between the mid-1960s and 2011, cultivation just fell off a cliff.
It did.
Like finger millet cultivation dropped by over 56%. And the other small millets experienced a catastrophic 82.5% decline. We're talking about an ecosystem shrinking from over 7.2 million hectares down to under 2 million.
It is one of the most rapid and devastating losses of agricultural heritage and ecological stability in modern history.
But wait, let me push back on this narrative for a second, because we're sitting here praising millets as the ultimate food.
Sure.
But wasn't the shift to paddy rice actually a massive upgrade for these farming families? Like, white rice cooks significantly faster, it requires less chewing, it's softer, and let's be honest, it's incredibly easy to process.
Right.
Are we just romanticizing a difficult past? Why would millions of people abandon millets if they were supposedly so perfect? Like, imagine having a hyper-efficient, solar-powered car available in the 1960s but deciding to abandon it for a gas guzzler anyway. Why do that?
It's a crucial question.
Uh-huh.
And you're hitting on the exact socioeconomic levers that drove this change.
Yeah.
People didn't abandon millets because they suddenly forgot they were nutritious.
Okay.
The abandonment was engineered by massive systemic policy interventions, primarily the public distribution system, or PDS, in India.
Okay, so how did the PDS system actually work on the ground to cause this?
Well, if we connect this to the bigger picture, in the wake of the Green Revolution in the 1960s, the Indian government needed to ensure national food security.
Right.
They focused heavily on high-yielding varieties of wheat and paddy rice. The government offered minimum support prices, essentially a guaranteed buyer for these two specific crops.
Okay, so a guaranteed market.
Yes. They would buy wheat and rice in massive quantities, store them in gigantic central silos, and then distribute them across the country through fair-price shops at heavily subsidized, dirt-cheap rates.
Got it. So if I'm a farmer in a rain-fed region, I can suddenly go to a local government shop and buy highly polished white rice for a few rupees a kilo.
Exactly. And simultaneously, millets were completely excluded from this massive government procurement system.
Wait, why?
Because small millets, once processed, are much harder to store for long periods in massive centralized silos. They are prone to rancidity and pest infestation because of their high fat and nutrient content.
Oh, because they're actually nutritious, they go bad faster.
Exactly. So the government favored the highly polished white rice, which is basically just pure starch and can sit in a warehouse for years without going bad.
Wow. And I imagine when the government decides something is the official staple, it changes the cultural perception.
Dramatically. Subsidized white rice became associated with modernity, government backing, and upward mobility.
Hmm.
Millets were suddenly stigmatized as poor man's food or, backward.
That's so sad.
We can actually trace this cultural erasure through language. Look at the linguistic shift in Tamil culture. Historically, the Tamil word for rice didn't just mean paddy rice. It referred to the dehusked edible product of any cereal grain.
Oh, interesting.
Yet you would specifically refer to little millet rice, foxtail millet rice, or kodo millet rice.
Because rice was a state of being processed, not a single species of grass.
Exactly. But as the PDS flooded every village with cheap paddy rice, the language slowly narrowed. Today, the word rice almost exclusively denotes white paddy rice. The other grains were quite literally erased from the everyday culinary vocabulary.
The cultural software was rewritten by the economic hardware.
That's a great way to put it.
But reading through the Vaikalp Sangam sources, it becomes incredibly clear that cheap government rice was only half the problem.
Right.
Even if people wanted to keep eating millets for their health, they were running into a physical wall. And that wall was the sheer, brutal, physical drudgery of processing the grain.
This is the crux of why millets vanish from local plates. You have to look at the anatomy of a small millet grain. Unlike a tomato or an apple, you can't just pick a millet panicle and eat it.
Yeah.
These grains, kodo, little, foxtail, proso, barnyard, and brown top, they grow encased in a tough, highly protective outer husk.
Which is great for the plant. That husk protects the seed from pests and drought.
It's brilliant for survival in the field,
Yeah.
but it makes the grain completely inedible for humans. That husk is rich in silica. It's hard, indigestible, and can actually damage your gastrointestinal tract.
Yikes. Okay, so you have to remove it.
Yes. To eat the millet, you must undergo primary processing to completely remove that husk without destroying the nutritious endosperm and bran layer inside.
And historically, across all these rural agricultural communities, the entirety of this intense physical processing fell exclusively on the shoulders of women.
Exclusively. It was culturally codified as women's work. And we really need to walk through exactly what this manual processing entailed, because it wasn't just a mild chore. It was a punishing daily athletic event.
Yeah, the reports detail this step by step, and it is exhausting just to read.
Right.
First, the women have to dry the harvested grains. They spread them out in the sun, monitoring them constantly, because if the moisture content isn't absolutely perfect, the grain will shatter into useless powder later on.
And that's just the prep. Once the moisture is right, the cleaning begins. They use a traditional flat woven winnowing pan.
Right.
In Tamil, this specific cleaning step is called nembuthal. It relies entirely on human aerodynamics.
Human aerodynamics, I like that.
Well, a woman stands, holding the pan filled with grain, and repeatedly tosses it into the air. She has to expertly angle the pan so the wind catches the light dust and chaff, blowing it away, while the heavier grains fall back into the basket.
That takes a lot of skill.
It does. And then she has to painstakingly comb through it by hand to pick out small stones, dirt clods, and weed seeds.
And at this point, the grain is still wearing its armor. Like, it's clean but inedible.
Right.
So then comes the dehusking phase. The women would use heavy wooden or stone grinders to initially crack the tough outer husks. But that's just the start.
Yeah, following the grinder, they had to transfer the grain into a heavy mortar and begin hand-pounding it with a massive wooden pestle.
Try to visualize the biomechanics of this for a second. You are lifting a heavy wooden pole over your head and driving it downward into a stone bowl over and over for hours.
It requires immense upper body, core, and back strength. The rhythmic pounding generates friction and compression to shear the husks off the kernels.
And even after an hour of relentless pounding, the job isn't done. Because now what's sitting in that mortar is just a chaotic mixture.
Exactly. You have clean, edible millet rice, but it's mixed with thousands of shattered husks, half-cracked grains, and grit.
So the women have to take it all out, put it back into the winnowing pan, and begin a second aerodynamic process called pudifal.
They toss and swirl the mixture, using the slight differences in weight and gravity to separate the edible rice from the unwanted waste fractions.
And here is the truly demoralizing part. One round of pounding and winnowing is rarely enough.
Oh no! To get entirely clean grain, they often had to repeat this entire cycle, pound, winnow, separate, repeat 2 or 3 times.
The case study actually quantifies this physical toll. It calculates that it takes a woman roughly 4 hours of heavy, back-breaking physical toil just to process 5 to 8 kilograms of grain.
4 hours of exhaustive labor for a yield that might only feed her family for 2 or 3 days.
Wow. When you frame it like that, everything makes sense. The PDS comes along and offers cheap, clean white rice that requires 0 pounding. Of course, the young women in these communities, as they gained access to basic education and other opportunities, started to rightfully refuse this immense drudgery.
Good for them, honestly.
Right, good for them. Why would you spend half your waking life pounding grain if an alternative exists?
You wouldn't. And that entirely justified refusal by a new generation of rural women caused the local supply chain to completely collapse.
Really? Completely.
Completely. Because the knowledge and willingness to manually process millets died out, and because there were no small-scale local machines to take over the work, the grain was essentially locked in its husk. It could no longer be eaten in the villages where it was grown.
But wait, if the demand just shifted, why didn't the processing just shift to factories right away? When wheat and paddy rice industrialized, massive commercial mills popped up everywhere. Why didn't someone just build a local millet factory in these villages to take the burden off the women? Why did the crop just vanish locally or turn into an export-only commercial crop shipped hundreds of miles away to places like Nasik, Maharashtra?
It comes down to economies of scale and the specific engineering challenges of the millet grain itself. Centralized agriculture relies on bulk. Small millets are grown in patches across harsh terrains, not in vast monolithic fields.
Okay, I see.
Local entrepreneurs didn't have the capital to build factories, and corporate processors weren't interested in setting up hundreds of tiny, decentralized mills. Instead, the crop transitioned from a local food source to an export-only commercial commodity.
Explain how that dynamic works. If I'm a farmer and my wife or daughter rightly refuses to process the millet, what do I do with the harvest?
You sell it raw, husk and all, to a middleman trader. That trader aggregates it from hundreds of farmers and trucks it hundreds of miles away. As you mentioned, the reports frequently mention places like Nasik, which is a major industrialized urban center in the state of Maharashtra.
Which generates massive food miles.
Exactly. The food travels enormous distances from farm to plate. In these giant centralized factories in Nasik, the millets are processed on a massive industrial scale.
But those factories aren't doing it the traditional way, right?
No. These giant factories prioritize shelf life over nutrition. They heavily polish the grain. They strip away the bran layer where most of the micronutrients live, leaving just a starchy core.
Oh, that's terrible.
Yeah. Then, this polished, less nutritious grain is packaged, marketed as a trendy superfood, and shipped to high-end supermarkets in urban centers like Mumbai or Delhi, sold at premium prices to wealthy city dwellers.
The irony is just tragic. The drought-resistant super grain grown by a struggling farmer in a rain-fed village gets shipped hundreds of miles away to be eaten by an urban tech worker.
While the farmer who grew it has to buy nutritionally bankrupt, subsidized white rice from the government just to feed his family.
Because local consumption was completely crowded out by the absolute absence of mid-level processing infrastructure?
Yes. The grain was trapped, both literally inside its husk and economically within a centralized extractive supply chain.
So if the problem is a lack of local machinery, we arrive at the core engineering challenge. Because it's not like people didn't try to solve this.
Oh, they tried.
But you can't just take a machine designed to shell paddy rice and pour small millets into it, right?
No, and for decades, particularly in the 1990s, that is exactly what local fabricators tried to do. They took standard paddy hullers, tweaked a few settings, and hoped for the best.
I'm guessing that didn't go well.
It was an engineering disaster. The primary hurdle in mechanizing small millets is the astonishing wild variation in the raw materials.
Right. If you've seen one grain of white rice, you've basically seen them all. They are relatively uniform.
Exactly. But small millets are a chaotic family of grains. They vary wildly in shape, in surface texture, in overall size, and most importantly, in how aggressively the outer husk is bonded to the inner kernel.
To give you listening a sense of this challenge, the Vikalp-Sangam report provides a fascinating data table comparing the physical hardness of different millets.
Yeah, the engineers literally measured the sheer physical force required to crack the husk of different varieties.
And the spectrum is huge. Let's look at the extremes. On one end, you have Kodo millet. It is the absolute hardest of the bunch. The data shows it requires a massive 25.5 newtons of physical force just to fracture the outer shell.
That's a lot of force.
It is. And even if you have a perfectly calibrated machine, the husk is so thick that you only expect to recover about 60 to 64% of the total weight as edible rice. The remaining 30+% is just waste husk and shattered breakage.
To put 25.5 newtons of force into a relatable context, imagine the torque you need to squeeze a heavy-duty metal nutcracker to shatter a thick macadamia nut. It requires a hard, sharp, and intense impact.
But then at the total opposite end of the spectrum, you have proso millet. It is incredibly soft. It only requires 14.3 newtons of force to crack nearly half the force of Kodo. Because the husk is thinner, it yields a 70 to 75% recovery rate of edible grain. That's more like lightly pressing a peanut shell until it crumbles.
Now imagine trying to design a single automated mechanical nutcracker that has to process both macadamia nuts and peanuts on the exact same assembly line.
That sounds impossible.
It's a nightmare. If you calibrate your machine to deliver the 25.5 newtons of force required for the Kodo millet, and you accidentally pour a batch of soft proso millet into the hopper,
You completely pulverize the proso. It turns into a cloud of useless, shattered dust.
precisely, you destroy the very food you are trying to extract. But if you reverse it and calibrate the machine for the gentle 14.3 newtons of the proso millet, and then pour in the Kodo millet,
The Kodo grains just bounce around inside the machine, having a great time, and come out the other end perfectly intact, husk and all.
exactly. Which means a cheap one-size-fits-all machine is physically impossible. You need highly tunable precision equipment.
Right?
Furthermore, setting up even a basic, small-scale mill isn't just about buying one magic box. The report outlines a mandatory minimum setup requiring 3 distinct, specialized pieces of equipment.
Okay, let's walk through that assembly line because it replaces all that grueling manual labor we talked about earlier.
Sure.
First, you have to replace the winnowing pan. So the raw grain goes into an aspirator with a grater.
The aspirator relies on the physics of airflow and density. Instead of a woman waiting for a breeze, an electric fan generates a precise, continuous column of air.
Okay.
As the grain falls through this air column, the light dust, empty husks, and chaff are blown away, while the heavier grains fall straight down onto a series of vibrating mechanical screens, the grater, which sorts the grains strictly by their physical size.
But that doesn't get rid of the stones, right? A stone might be the exact same size as a millet grain, but it's much heavier.
Correct. So from the grater, it moves to the destiner.
And the destiner is a beautiful piece of specialized engineering. It combines an inclined vibrating deck with upward airflow.
Yeah, the air lifts the lighter millet grains, making them behave almost like a fluid flowing down the incline.
But the heavier stones aren't lifted by the air.
No, they sit directly on the vibrating deck, and the mechanical vibration slowly walks the heavy stones up the incline and out a separate chute.
That is so cool. So now we have perfectly clean grain, exactly the same size with no stones. Now we finally reach the main event, the dehusking machine or the huller.
And tracing the technological evolution of the huller reveals exactly how we solved the Kodo versus proso hardness problem.
Tell me about it.
Well, early fabricators tried several mechanical principles. The first major attempt was the emery mill. This works on the principle of abrasion.
Like sanding.
Exactly. Think of a giant grinding wheel made of rough emery stone. It essentially tries to replicate the ancient mortar and pestle by vigorously rubbing the grains against a rough surface until the husks wear off.
The problem with abrasion is that it generates enormous amounts of heat, and it acts like sandpaper. It doesn't just wear off the husk, it sands right through the nutritious bran layer of the grain, essentially polishing it by force.
Exactly. So engineers moved to the rubber roller mill. This relies on compression and shearing. 2 large rubber cylinders spin toward each other at slightly different speeds.
Okay.
As the grain passes between them, it gets squeezed and twisted, popping the husk off.
That sounds gentler than sandpaper.
It is, and it's very effective for paddy rice.
Uh-huh.
But remember those wild variations in millet size.
Oh, right.
If the rollers are set even a fraction of a millimeter too close together, they crush the millet. If they're too far apart, the millet slips right through. Adjusting rubber rollers for tiny millet grains proved incredibly frustrating and inconsistent.
Which brings us to the ultimate technological winner, the breakthrough that changed everything, the centrifugal impact huller. I love the physics of this machine. Here's where it gets really interesting. If abrasion is like sandpaper and rubber rollers are like a rolling pin, the centrifugal impact huller is like a high-speed pitching machine throwing a baseball against a clay wall.
That is a perfect analogy. The grain drops into the center of a rapidly spinning impeller, a centrifuge. Centrifugal force pushes the grain outward at tremendous velocity along the spinning vanes.
Wow.
Surrounding the spinning impeller is a hard, stationary outer ring, often made of specialized polymer or metal. The grain is physically hurled outward, flying through the air, and smashes into that hard outer wall.
And it is the exact kinetic energy of that sudden impact that fractures the hard silica shell, cracking it open like an egg, while leaving the dense, nutritious kernel inside perfectly intact. No rubbing, no squeezing, just pure calculated impact.
But here is the genius part. How do you adjust for the 25.5 newtons needed for Kodo versus the 14.3 newtons needed for Proso?
Right, how do you do that without changing the machine?
You don't have to change out grinding wheels or adjust the physical gaps between rollers. You simply change the velocity of the grain.
You just throw it harder or softer.
Exactly. And you control that velocity using a piece of electrical engineering called a variable frequency drive, or a VFD.
Let's break down the VFD. How does an operator actually use it?
Well, an AC electric motor's speed is dictated by the frequency of the electrical current supplied to it. A VFD sits right between the power source and the motor. The operator essentially has a digital dial.
Okay.
By turning the dial, the VFD alters the frequency of the electricity, which seamlessly and precisely increases or decreases the RPM, the revolutions per minute, of the spinning centrifuge.
So if the operator sees a batch of rock-hard Kodo millet, they crank up the VFD. The motor screams, the centrifuge spins at maximum RPM, hurling the grains at blistering speeds to generate a massive impact force against the wall.
And if the next farmer brings in soft Proso millet, the operator dials the VFD down. The centrifuge slows to a gentle spin, tossing the grains just hard enough to crack the delicate shell without shattering the soft kernel inside. It is ultimate precision, controlled by a simple dial.
It's absolutely brilliant. It takes complex physics and makes it so accessible. And over the last 5 to 10 years, these small-scale fabricators have rapidly iterated on this design based on direct feedback from the field.
They really have. They've optimized the angles of the impact rings to improve the recovery rate of whole grains. They've made the motors highly energy efficient. And critically, they solved a major infrastructure hurdle: power supply.
Right, the difference between single-phase and three-phase power.
Exactly. Massive industrial machines require three-phase industrial power, which is practically non-existent in deep rural agricultural villages. These new centrifugal hullers are designed specifically to run on standard single-phase electricity.
The same kind of power you use to run a refrigerator or a ceiling fan in a normal house.
Exactly. And they also engineered the physical footprint to be remarkably small. You don't need a sprawling factory floor. You can fit this entire three-machine setup, the aspirator, destiner, and huller, into a large shed or a spare room.
And most importantly, from a social perspective, they entirely redesigned the ergonomics. Older agricultural machinery was notoriously dangerous, with exposed belts and high-loading hoppers that required immense strength to lift grain bags into.
Yeah, safety was a huge issue.
But the new machines have enclosed moving parts, integrated dust cyclones to protect respiratory health, and lowered hopper heights. They made them vastly easier and significantly safer for women to operate independently.
What's fascinating here is that the technology isn't just processing grain, it is democratizing the very means of production.
Yes.
It is taking the power away from the massive centralized factories in distant cities like Nasik and physically handing the hardware right back to the rural communities.
But technology in a vacuum is useless. An impact hauler sitting in a box doesn't feed anyone.
Which brings us to the human element, the transition from theory to reality.
And this is where the Vikhalp Sangam reports really shine. They don't just talk about the machines. They profile the pioneers on the ground who actually took on the immense financial and personal risk to build local ecosystems around this hardware.
Right.
Let's look at the first profile, Mr. Jeyaraman.
Yes, Jeyaraman. He operates out of Thopur in the Salem district of Tamil Nadu. It's a semi-urban, highly agricultural region. He's 47 years old, holds a degree in food science, and is a perfect example of a seasoned local tradesman spotting an ethical gap in the market.
Before he got into processing, he was just a trader, right? He was buying and selling patty rice.
Yes. But because of his food science background, he acutely understood the nutritional superiority of small millets. He saw diabetes rising in his community, and he saw a burgeoning local demand from health-conscious buyers. So he decided to start sourcing processed small millets to sell in his shop.
But when he went to the large, centralized commercial mills in places like Sydney to buy bulk millet rice, he was horrified by what he saw.
He realized those massive commercial mills were fundamentally ruining the food. They were only offering highly polished small millet rice.
Let's explain why polishing is so detrimental. We touched on it earlier, but what is physically happening to the grain?
Once you remove the tough outer husk, what remains is the edible kernel. But that kernel has layers. The outermost layer is the bran.
Right.
The bran contains almost all the dietary fiber, the essential fatty acids, the minerals, and the vitamins. Beneath the bran is the endosperm, which is mostly just pure starchy carbohydrates.
So why do industrial mills polish off the bran if it's the best part?
Two reasons. First, aesthetics. Urban consumers have been conditioned by white patty rice to think that white and shiny means clean and premium. The bran layer makes millets look brown or dull.
Of course.
And second, shelf life. The fatty acids in the bran can go rancid. It's stored in a hot warehouse for a year. By violently buffing off the bran layer using abrasive machines, industrial mills increase the shelf life and make it look pretty.
But they literally grind away the medicine. They strip away the micronutrients and fiber, leaving a high glycemic starch ball that actively contributes to diabetes.
Exactly. And Jeyaraman saw this happening and realized his community was being robbed of the actual nutrition. They were paying a premium for compromised product. He decided he had to offer unpolished, nutritionally intact millet rice, and the only way to ensure the quality was to process it himself.
Such dedication, undergoing a costly trial and error approach just to master these machines.
Oh, absolutely. So in 2013, he partnered with a friend and started small. By 2015, using entirely his own funds, which shows immense conviction, he built a fully self-sustained unit in Thamper. He purchased the entire mandated setup, the aspirator destiner grater, the precision centrifugal huller with a VFD, and a pulverizer for making flour.
His operation is a masterclass in localized economics. He processes about 500 kilograms of grain a day. That's a massive amount for a local community, but a rounding error for a giant commercial mill. And I love his procurement model. He doesn't deal with massive anonymous supply chains. He buys raw grain directly from local farmers and local farmers producer organizations.
By cutting out the middleman aggregators and transport brokers, he frees up margin. And he passes that margin directly to the growers. He consistently pays his local farmers a premium of 1 or 2 rupees over the standard market price for their raw grain.
That immediately incentivizes the farmers in his district to keep planting millets instead of switching to thirsty cash crops. But he also had to learn a hard lesson about who to sell the finished product to, didn't he?
He did. Initially, he tried to operate like a standard wholesaler, selling his unpolished millets on credit to distant urban buyers. But he quickly found that distant wholesalers were unreliable.
Yeah.
Payments were delayed, and the credit cycles choked his cash flow. So he executed a hard pivot back to his local community.
He decided to operate strictly on a cash basis, selling almost exclusively within a 100-kilometer radius of his mill.
And it worked beautifully. Because he offers a genuinely nutritious, unpolished product, local demand surged. Women from nearby villages traveled to buy directly from him because they understand the health benefits for managing household diabetes.
And he doesn't just sell, he educates. He conducts cooking demonstrations to teach people how to prepare unpolished grains, which require slightly different water ratios and cooking times than white rice.
He transformed from a simple rice trader into a localized food educator and a linchpin of community health. Today, his single 500-kilogram-a-day mill reliably serves about 1,000 local families. It's an incredible achievement.
It really is. But the report doesn't just profile experienced tradesmen.
Yeah.
The second pioneer they highlight comes from a totally different demographic, representing the next generation. Let's talk about Mr. Janakan from Rasipuram.
Janakan's story is fascinating because it illustrates the collision of modern engineering education with ancient ecological wisdom. He is a 29-year-old mechanical engineer. He had the degree, he had the corporate prospects, but he felt profoundly disconnected. He was searching for meaningful work that actually impacted his environment.
And interestingly, he didn't start with machinery. He started with seeds.
Right. He became deeply involved in agricultural conservation.
Yeah.
He noticed that while NGOs were doing a lot of work to save rare native varieties of paddy rice, the ancient native varieties of small millets were being completely ignored and lost to history.
So what did he do?
He traveled extensively, personally collecting and preserving native seeds.
Yeah.
He amassed a seed bank featuring 23 distinct varieties of native sorghum, 12 varieties of foxtail millet, and dozens of others.
It's a noble effort. But then he hit a massive practical wall. You
Right.
can't just keep seeds in a jar. They have to be planted to survive.
Exactly.
So he goes out to the local farmers with these rare, ancient, highly resilient seeds and essentially says, here, plant these instead of your commercial crops.
And the farmers, who are pragmatic business people operating on razor-thin margins, look at this young engineer and ask the obvious questions.
Yeah.
Why should we plant this? Who's going to buy it? And more importantly, who is going to process it? We can't eat it raw.
It was a brutal reality check.
It was a light bulb moment for Janakan. He realized a fundamental truth of agricultural economics. Conservation without a guaranteed market is practically impossible.
Yep.
A farmer cannot take the immense financial risk of dedicating a season's harvest to a native seed if there is no local infrastructure to turn that harvest into cash or edible food.
So if he wanted them to grow it, he had to guarantee he would buy it. And if he bought it, he had to know how to process it. What do you think the listener should take away from these two distinct profiles? The experienced local tradesman versus the young, educated engineer turning back to agriculture?
They both represent the critical missing link between production and consumption.
Yeah.
They aren't just millers. They are local market makers. By paying premiums, exchanging processed grains for raw materials, and offering custom hiring, they completely de-risk the cultivation of millets for local farmers.
Right. And speaking of Janakan, he approached this with the meticulous rigor of an engineer. He didn't just buy a machine and guess. He spent a year and a half just traveling. He visited different operating mills across the state, observing the operators, studying the machinery, understanding the nuances of moisture content and abrasive forces.
Once he understood the system, he went all in. He secured government credit programs designed for young entrepreneurs, paired it with bank loans, and built a facility worth 1.5 million rupees, or 15 lakhs in Indian terminology.
To contextualize that figure, an investment of 1.5 million rupees for a 29-year-old in a rural Indian setting is an astronomical capital risk.
It's massive.
It's the equivalent of taking out a massive small business loan to construct a full factory floor from scratch. And on top of the facility costs, he had to invest another 1.5 million rupees just to secure the raw grain stock from the farmers to start his operations.
He put everything on the line, and because of his engineering background, his facility is highly optimized. He leans heavily into the technology. He is a master at using those variable frequency drives we talked about.
Constantly calibrating the centrifuge speeds to perfectly match the specific batch of native seeds a farmer brings in, ensuring maximum recovery of the unpolished kernel.
Right. And he operates at a highly impressive scale for a localized unit. He employs 4 laborers, running shifts that process 500 kilograms at a time. He currently supplies between 6 and 10 tons of unpolished millets every single month,
Wow.
acting as the primary processor for around 50 different organic retailers in the region.
He's serving an estimated 6,000 families.
It's incredibly.
But the detail about Janakan's operation that I find most brilliant is his closed-loop, zero-waste approach. When you process that much grain, you generate a lot of waste. The cracked husks and the shattered pieces of millet that didn't survive the huller.
In a centralized industrial system, that waste is often just discarded or burned. But Janakan treats every byproduct as a revenue stream and an ecological resource.
Yeah.
He takes the separated, cracked husks and runs them through a pulverizer to create a specific type of coarse flour. He takes the broken, shattered millet kernels, which are still highly nutritious, just too small to sell as premium rice, and formulates them into high-density cattle feed for local dairy farmers.
It makes his entire operation incredibly economically resilient. He extracts value from every single atom of the harvest.
Exactly.
So bringing it all together, we've talked about how they offer something called custom hiring, which is a game changer for the local families. Let's explain what that is.
Custom hiring is the ultimate democratization of the machine. It means a local farming family can harvest a small batch of millets from their own field, say 30 kilograms, meant entirely for their own kitchen. They don't have to sell it to a trader. They can simply load it onto a scooter, bring it to Janakan's mill, and pay him a very small nominal service fee. Janakan runs their specific grain through his sophisticated machinery and hands them back perfectly clean, dehusked, unpolished millet rice.
So they pay a tiny fee to rent the use of the machine for 20 minutes.
Exactly. It completely bypasses the commercial market. It allows the farmers to eat the very super grains they're growing, closing the loop on local food security.
Which brings us to the final, most profound segment of our deep dive today. We've zoomed in on the molecular biology of the plants, the physics of the hullers, and the business models of the operators. Now let's zoom out. What are the immediate day-to-day ripples in the societal ecosystem when these decentralized processing units come online?
The most immediate, measurable, and profound impact is on the daily lives of rural women. We established earlier that manually processing 5 to 8 kilograms of grain took a woman 4 hours of grueling, bone-weary labor.
Right, lifting the heavy pestle, pounding the grain, winnowing in the sun.
Now, compare that to the custom hiring model we just discussed. A family needs roughly 25 to 35 kilograms of grain for a month's supply. Under the old manual system, a woman would have to dedicate multiple entire days of sheer physical exertion every month just to make that grain edible.
That's just wild to think about.
But today, she brings that 30-kilogram sack to Jeyaraman's mill. The VFD is calibrated, the centrifuge spins, and that entire month's supply is perfectly processed in just 20 to 45 minutes.
It is a staggering reclamation of time. You are effectively handing a woman back several full days of her life every single month. You are completely eliminating a major source of chronic physical pain and drudgery.
And that technological shift triggered an unexpected but entirely welcome sociological shift regarding gender roles in these villages.
Because suddenly processing isn't just women's work anymore.
Exactly. Historically, because the processing happened via mortar and pestle inside the domestic courtyard, it was strictly demarcated as female labor. Men generally refused to participate. They wouldn't touch the winnowing pan. However, mechanization inherently changed the geography and the nature of the task.
Processing moved from the courtyard to the local industrial shed.
Yes. It now involves transporting heavy 30-kilo sacks on motorcycles, interacting with the mill operator, and paying a fee, because the task was recontextualized around machinery and transport domains that patriarchal norms often code as male men suddenly began to willingly participate.
Oh.
Fathers, husbands, and sons are now the ones strapping the sacks to their bikes, taking them to the mill, and waiting for the grain. By mechanizing the process, the community inadvertently broke a rigid gender barrier, actively sharing the load of securing the household's food.
It's a brilliant example of how a seemingly neutral piece of technology, a centrifuge, can physically rewrite a social contract.
It really is.
And beyond the social dynamics, there is a massive economic course correction happening here. Earlier, we discussed how millets had bizarrely morphed into an elite food.
The urban health food paradox.
Right. Because of the massive food miles shipping raw grain to Nasik, running it through giant industrial polishers, aggressively marketing it in glossy packaging, and placing it in high-end urban supermarkets, millet rice became this trendy, highly expensive commodity. Wealthy tech workers in Bangalore were buying it to manage their diets, while the rural farmers who actually grew it couldn't possibly afford to buy it back. They were relying instead on the cheap government white rice.
Decentralized processing is the only mechanism capable of shattering that paradox. When you strip out the long-haul trucking costs, eliminate the massive corporate middlemen, and remove the expensive urban marketing budgets, the true cost of the grain plummets.
So what does this all mean?
Well, operators like Janakan and Jeyaraman are successfully transforming small millets back into what they were always meant to be, an incredibly affordable, highly nutritious mass food for the exact populations who need it most.
Right. A single point of friction dehusking caused a cascade of negative effects. Loss of biodiversity, malnutrition, rural poverty, and a single technological intervention is reversing it. And this localized success connects so deeply to the overarching philosophy we constantly see championed across the Vekhelp Sangam sources.
Yes, absolutely.
This specific case study about a hulling machine isn't just a quirky story about grain. It is a highly functioning microcosm of a much wider ideological movement.
It's the physical manifestation of bioregionalism.
Explain bioregionalism in this context for us.
Bioregionalism is the idea that political and economic systems should be organized around natural ecological boundaries rather than arbitrary state lines or globalized supply chains.
Okay, that makes sense.
It advocates that a local region should strive to be as self-sustaining as possible.
Mm.
It means relying on native, climate-adapted crops like the C4 millets rather than importing water-heavy foreign seeds. It means replacing massive, extractive, centralized corporate models with localized circular economies where wealth and nutrition remain within the community that generated them.
It proves that alternative development isn't just some utopian academic theory discussed in university seminars. It is a practical, functioning, highly profitable reality when the right tools are placed in the right hands.
But, and this is a crucial warning explicitly highlighted in the report, we cannot mistake a successful prototype for a completed system. This raises an important question.
You mean the fact that Jeyaraman and Janakan are still exceptions rather than the rule?
Exactly. They succeeded through a combination of sheer grit, costly trial and error, substantial personal financial risk, and in Janakan's case, formal engineering education. But if the goal is to scale this transformation across the entirety of rural India, we cannot simply wait for thousands of lone wolf engineering heroes to magically appear.
Right. The state must step in with structured, massive institutional support, because just throwing money at the problem doesn't work.
No, it doesn't.
The report actually points out a tragic reality. There are currently countless millet processing machines, often purchased through well-meaning NGO grants or government subsidy schemes, that are just sitting defunct, slowly rusting away in the corners of various villages.
It is a classic failure of top-down development.
Yeah.
A government agency buys a centrifugal huller, drops it in a village, cuts a ribbon, and leaves.
Yeah.
But the machine is useless without the human software to run it. If the local operator doesn't deeply understand the physics of the grain, the machine will fail.
If they don't know how to assess the exact moisture level of a batch, or if they don't understand how to calibrate the VFD to adjust the RPM for Kodo versus Proso millet, they will end up either pulverizing the grain into dust or leaving the husks completely intact.
And when a farmer pays for a batch to be processed and gets a bag of dust back, they never return. The mill loses money, shuts down, and the machine rusts. The hardware is available, the consumer demand is rising, but the knowledge transfer is severely lacking.
So what's the fix?
What is desperately required now are state-sponsored capacity-building programs. We need dedicated training centers where aspiring rural entrepreneurs can spend weeks learning the precise mechanics, electrical calibration, and business models required to operate these micromills successfully.
It's exactly like giving a community a grand piano, completely out of tune, and refusing to teach anyone how to read sheet music. The potential for a masterpiece is sitting right there, but without the training, it's just heavy furniture.
Precisely. The invisible architecture of training and support is what turns a machine into a movement.
Which brings us to the ultimate takeaway for today's deep dive. As you listen to this, we really want you to consider a profound shift in how we view the future of food. When we talk about fighting global diabetes or creating a food system resilient to the brutal realities of climate change, the conversation almost exclusively revolves around biology. We obsess over what magical, ancient, drought-resistant seeds we should be planting in the ground.
But the seed is only the promise of nutrition. The infrastructure is the delivery.
Exactly. The future of sustainable agriculture relies just as heavily on the completely unglamorous mid-level mechanical infrastructure that makes eating those crops practically possible for everyday people.
Yes.
We absolutely need the native seeds, yes, but we equally need the properly calibrated centrifuges, the variable frequency drives, the single-phase electrical motors, and the highly trained local operators. That mid-level engineering is the true load-bearing backbone of a sustainable food system. If we ignore the processing, the crop rots in the field. But when we empower the processing, we literally revive an entire ecosystem.
It's a potent reminder that innovation doesn't always look like an app or a rocket ship. Sometimes, the most revolutionary innovation on the planet is a small machine in a rural shed, allowing a community to feed itself.
And that leaves us with a final, slightly provocative thought for you to mull over as you go about your day. We so frequently talk about modern technology as an isolating force, something that fundamentally pulls us away from nature, divorces us from our ancestral roots, and locks us into an artificial future. We equate technology with screens, algorithms, and industrial extraction. But what if that is a failure of imagination? What if the ultimate highest purpose of modern precision engineering isn't to replace the past, but to act as a bridge? To make ancient, deeply sustainable ways of living viable and accessible again in the 21st century?
It is a completely different paradigm. using a digitally controlled, electrically powered centrifuge to bring a 3,000-year-old, climate-resilient super grain back to the daily dinner table, saving millions of gallons of water in the process.
It fundamentally changes how you view a machine. It makes you wonder, what other traditional, highly sustainable practices in your own life or in your own local community are just one accessible piece of technology away from making a massive comeback? What is the jammed gear in your local ecosystem just waiting for the right engineer to fix it? Thank you so much for joining us on this deep dive into the Vikalp Sangam reports. We hope you found your aha moment today and that you look at a bowl of grain a little differently tomorrow. Keep learning, stay curious, and we'll catch you on the next deep dive.